Don't worry, buddy. You're doing fine. I won't let you blow this. What kind of place is this?
Welcome back to Kirill Smashes Acting. I'm Kirill, actor, educator, cat enthusiast. I know I've been gone for a while, but for those of you that don't know, I actually ended up going back to teaching college this semester. Sadly, the college is a bit of a commute, so that's kind of killed my usual filming and editing time. But now that's been solved, I'm still teaching, and we're back. So get ready for more videos coming at least once a week. Today's video is shot at the Argo Novice Film Studio here in Columbus, Georgia. And since this is a professional setup, sadly there's not going to be any cats in this video. Today we're going to continue shifting our focus to modern theater by learning about theater spaces. When we think of theaters, we tend to think about one type of theater. What do you think of when you think of a theater? Does it look like a movie theater? Does it look like the Fox Theater? The reality is that theater spaces have changed and developed over history. So today, we're going to take a journey through theater history and take a look to see how these spaces have changed over time and how that has affected what modern theaters are designed like today. We're first going to start all the way back in ancient Greece. All the Greek theaters back in the day started out as open-air theaters, and the ones that have survived from the height of the Greek theater scene are all built into hills. As you can see in this image, this massive amphitheater was built right into the hill, and you can see how large that allows the theater to be. I want you to imagine for a moment that everyone in the town would come to the Festival of Dionysus to see these shows. If you look toward the stage, you can see the round orchestra and the skene, or the theater house on the other side of the stage. This is looking at the theater space from above. And as you can see how the audience area was shaped, the circular orchestra and the square area that is the altar. Now we have archaeological evidence to suggest that the altar was often used for animal sacrifices before the shows. This was of course done mostly during the festivals, and most of the animals sacrificed were goats. Down at the bottom, you can see the stage and then the skene. Remember, that's the theater house. The skene was usually actually 2 levels, and the machina, which is a giant basket, kind of on a rake, would be there as well. Have you ever heard of the term deus ex machina? That term is a literary device where everything has gotten so bad that the only way the protagonist can get out of the situation is if the gods, or some overly powerful source, comes down to rectify the situation. A modern example of this would be a novel where everything gets really messed up for the character, and in the end, they wake up and find out it was just a dream. In Greek theater, the machina was basically a basket where an actor playing one of the gods would descend down from the heavens, well, the second level. This would represent the gods coming down from Mount Olympus. Once down on Earth, the gods would oftentimes come out of the machine and set everything right. This would oftentimes include making sure that the message of the play was clear to the characters and to the audience by proxy. We've spent a lot of time in this class talking about message. And in Greek theater, the deus ex machina, the gods coming down from above, would often be the ones to deliver this message to make sure that everyone in the audience learned what they were supposed to learn from the play. The term deus ex machina actually translates to the machine of the gods. The term itself comes directly from this exact Greek theater tradition. As theater history moves on to the next big civilization, there came the Romans. And the Romans loved to plagiarize. They modeled many of their theater traditions from the Greek culture. When you look at this picture of a Roman theater, you can see the similarities between this and the Greek theater we looked at before. Unlike the Greek theater, the Romans actually built their theaters inside the city. This meant that the theaters were no longer built into hills like Greek theaters would be, but they would become standalone structures. Though both theaters are still outdoors and still open air. Because of the change of design from hillside to standalone structure, the shape of the theater had to change just a little bit. So the audience became a little less circular and a bit more of a half circle. The orchestra is now a half circle instead of a full circle. And the seats are just slightly different. You can still see that there's a theater house as well as a proscanon. A proscanon is an important term, but it really just means anything that's built right in front of the theater house. This includes a second, higher stage, if the production calls for it, as well as any side stages built right before the theater house. There's also, all the way in the back, a decorated supporting wall that you could see right behind the stage. We also see a long, narrow stage, a little bit smaller than what Greek theater would have been. Most Roman plays actually took place in a street, often in front of important houses, maybe government houses or houses of nobility. Hence why the backdrop is almost always a well-designed and decorated building facade. That way the play can take place on the street in front of these important homes. While on occasion, you would see some of the productions use different balconies or characters coming out of windows, but that was more the exception than the rule. The thing to remember about the Romans is that they tended to prefer much more violent entertainment. This is the time period when we had Christians being fed to lions, gladiator battles to the death, all in front of a live audience. And because of the change in taste, live theater was not as prominent culturally as it was during the Greek era. Theater in Rome was mostly about how great the city-state was. Most of the art from this time was very nationalistic. It focused on themes about what it meant to be a Roman citizen and how strong the city-state was on the world stage. To be fair, we do not have a lot of fine art from this time, but some of the important pieces have survived. Seneca, a name you might have heard of, was a playwright who mostly focused on tragedies during this period. He wrote a very important play that was later adapted by a playwright you might have heard of called William Shakespeare into his play Titus Andronicus. Fun fact, this story was also adopted by the show South Park in an episode named Scott Tenorman Must Die. One of my favorites from when I was young. In each one of these adaptations, the story consists of a meal between two enemies. One of them discusses the desire for a truce. They agree, they both celebrate, they eat well, they drink, and then the one who asked for a truce tells his now friend that that friend is actually eating the body of his dead wife and children. This is a very, very gruesome play, but it is still one of the most important pieces that survived all the way through history, and we still have. On the other side of the spectrum, another piece from Rome ended up inspiring the Shakespeare play, A Comedy of Errors. And if you've never seen it, the play is about twins separated at birth who never met and grew up completely separately. One day, they cross paths in the same town. This, of course, leads to comic situations, mostly stemming from mistaken identity. I'm sure you've heard this one before. This story has been adapted way too many times to count. Eventually, Constantine, Emperor of Rome at the time, became a Christian and outlawed theater. This plunges us into what we call the Dark Ages. Over time in the church, they began to take what's called the liturgy. This is a kind of call and response event that becomes kind of like a play. As time went on, Bible stories actually became a part of the church liturgy, and then it began to grow into what we think of as theater. These shows eventually became big enough to become their own event. The church would soon start holding little festivals where these stories would be played out to audiences. Not just the congregation, but anybody who was walking by and wanted to see the show. As this began to grow in popularity, churches began to erect small balconies that would be used as stages. What you see here are what these balconies, or porches, built into the church might look like. These shows continued to grow in popularity, and these porches began to be built for mobility. This way, the performers would often move these porches all the way to the town square. Once these porches became mobile, they began to be called mansions. They were called mansions because they were each part of a set, kind of like Legos. And when you put them together, it brings the entire setting to the forefront. At the very right of this picture, you could see this giant mouth opened up. During this time, the gates of hell were thought to be this giant mouth that would open up and swallow the sinner into hell. So the right side here would be representative of hell in this production. On the far left side of this image would be the mansion that represented heaven. These setups were really common during the medieval era of theater. Many of the stories had moral lessons that would often show how the virtuous character would follow the teachings of the church and would end up in heaven, while a character meant to represent sin would end up in hell, oftentimes begging for forgiveness. But since they were already stuck in hell, they were trapped, and their pleading for forgiveness was met with deaf ears. This developed at the same time in history when guilds began to emerge. Guilds are organizations of professional workers meant to help train new people into the profession, as well as protect and help others understand what it is that these professional people do. This included guilds for all kinds of things. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and other tradesmen would all have their own guilds. These guilds would often sponsor performers to develop plays based on Bible stories that would relate to what these guilds do. So you might have boat makers, for example, sponsoring a theater troupe to put on the story of Noah's Ark, since, well, there's a boat. The other guilds would sponsor the performers to put up other Bible stories that related to what they do. This became such a popular practice that eventually these troupes would be able to perform all of the Bible stories from Genesis all the way to the end. This would be called cycles. Think about it this way, from the beginning to the end, and then they would start over and go all the way through again, hence cycles. Oftentimes, they would set up the booths spread out in an open area, and the audience would go from the first, Genesis, all the way, booth by booth by booth by booth, to the end, Revelations. On occasion, the troops would actually take the performances through the town square, kind of like a parade, moving from place to place, showing it to different crowds. This led to the development of very mobile stages called pageant wagons. Once pageant wagons were part of the theater scene, performers would spend most of the time during their year going from town to town and performing their plays for different audiences. Since these performances were outside and they were free, this expanded the reach of live performance to anyone, no matter what social class they were from. This actually continued for quite a while. Eventually, history gets to what we call the Renaissance. We're going to start in Renaissance Italy first. In Renaissance Italy, most theater became commedia dell'arte. This was the era when popular theater moved away from their connections to the church and became more about stories that anyone could relate to. Commedia itself was a very improvisational performance style. Think Judd Apatow, or imagine Whose Line Is It Anyway, combined with masks and way over-the-top performances. Nothing like what we think of when we think of realism, which we've talked about. These performances would also be done in the town square and would be accessible to almost everyone in the population. This made commedia extremely popular because anybody could go see it. At this exact time, over in England, we saw the building of the first Globe Theatre. Sadly, the original one burned down, but there is another one in its place. This was used by Shakespeare and his troupe. If we look at how the original Globe Theatre was built, you can see a general admission style standing room pit, and then balconies of seats surrounding the pit. But unlike how we currently do seating today, the people that were standing at the pit, all the way in the bottom, even though they were the closest to the stage, they were occupying what we would call today the cheap seats. These audience members were called the groundlings. They were lower class, peasants, or professional workers, and the admission to this area was very low cost. As such, most people living in the area could afford to go, at least on occasion. The seats, especially the higher up you got, were considerably more expensive. The highest rungs of the balcony, probably the furthest away from the actual show, were the most expensive and were almost exclusively for royalty and nobility. The plays during this time did not use a lot of scenery, But they did have a lot of trapdoors and other ways to create spectacle to really capture the imagination of the audience. That's why in Shakespeare, so many of the characters talk about where they are, because at the time, they didn't use backdrops to show you where they are. Now, if we travel back to Italy, we have the Teatro Olimpico, and it was the first recorded indoor theater. And this is way before electricity. As you have seen in this lecture, everything that came before this was all outdoor spaces, so they needed different ways to light it. Fun fact, to this day, they still perform there. Another unique aspect of this theater is how similar it actually was to Roman theater spaces. At the time this theater was built, there was very little knowledge about Greek culture. Many of the great documents, plays, and artifacts that we have today from the Greeks, well, they hadn't been discovered yet. Because of this, most of their knowledge from theater actually came from the Roman tradition. If you look in this picture, you could see how similar the painted backdrop is to the cityscape backdrop used in Roman theaters. The biggest difference was that now the creation of the backdrop was used with an understanding of perspective. If you look at the street in the back, it almost looks like it goes on for quite a bit of distance. But in reality, this is how we perceive this type of design. If you've ever taken an art class, you'd be very familiar with this technique. The technique itself is really quite well illustrated in this image. I, of course, am not an artist and terrible with drawing anything, so I'd be the worst person to do this. But most people can follow this design and create a decent perspective in whatever they're painting. If you look at this ground plan, you can see how the hallways at the back of the stage go backward and get more narrow. These hallways, from the audience's point of view, look to be much longer and much more prominent than they really are. We actually still use this type of forced perspective today. Next time you go to a museum, take a look and see if you could find pictures that use this technique. Eventually, in the late 19th century, this type of theater became extremely popular, and audience members would often go just to be seen. This counts especially for the people in the balconies. The higher up they get, it would be a marker of their social status because they can afford to be there and everyone else can't. Now that we've gone through history, let's take a look at what type of theaters we have today. The most common one, and the most connected to what we've learned so far, would be the proscenium theater. The proscenium theater is called that because of that giant arch that frames the performers as if they're in a painting. There's audience only on one side, and in front of them is the stage. That arc is called the proscenium arc. In this picture, you can see what we call false prosceniums. Arches that are smaller behind the proscenium arch. As you can see, they get smaller and smaller and further away. This functions kind of like a zoom lens. It focuses you into what you're supposed to be watching. Here in Atlanta, both the Fox Theater and the Alliance Theater use this type of theater as their main stages. While this is probably the most common theater setup you see nowadays, there aren't that many new theaters being built that way. They're big, they're expensive, and that means anything that's produced there is going to be big and expensive. Another very popular type of modern theater is called a thrust theater. Also, often called a three-quarter thrust because, as you can see, there will be audience surrounding 3 of the 4 sides of the stage. In this type of theater, there's usually a back wall where the backdrop is, and then a stage jutting out from there into the audience. This creates a much more intimate experience for the audience, while bringing in quite a few challenges for the performers and for the director. Because of this setup, the audience oftentimes cannot see an actor fully. Hell, they might only be able to see just their back. In a thrust, the performers and the directors have to be much more aware of what every single seat in the audience would see as they rehearse the show. You can't just perform to the audience anymore. The movement has to be a bit more realistic, but you do have to think about sight lines and what everybody at every angle might be seeing or what they might be missing. The next thing we have is an arena theater, also known as theater in the round. The important thing to understand about an arena theater is that the audience will surround the performers at all times, but the stage does not have to be round. Hence why many people choose to say arena theater instead of theater in the round, because the stage itself, even though it's surrounded, could be square, could be rectangle, could be hexagonal, whatever you want it to be. In this style of theater, there is no backdrop. So the entire setting is told to the audience through what the actors are doing and through props. By surrounding the performers, the show becomes very intimate. Since the performers are surrounded, they have no direction where they can hide, and they must be consistent in their character work, no matter what actions they're performing or what may or may not happen during their performance. Audience members are also able to see the rest of the audience across from them, which, by the way, becomes really annoying if someone's texting. Really annoying. Fun fact, this is my absolute personal favorite theater design to perform in. I'm not alone. Many actors enjoy arena theater spaces because it forces them to work on their endurance as performers. No matter what happens, you can't even turn around to gather yourself. You must be in character. This setup also challenges performers to be very responsive to everything that's happening in the story around them. Oftentimes, much of the audience can only see the face of the actors that are listening. They might not be able to see who's talking at all. It is in these moments that being an active listener becomes vital for each actor. The information that the listening actor gives to the audience would be the difference between the play making sense to everybody or half of the audience not understanding what is really going on. We also have alley theaters. Sometimes they're known as traverse theaters, tennis court theaters, or corridor theaters. In this style, the stage is a long strip and it's surrounded by audience on two sides, usually on the wide sides. This can be a really fun and innovative theatrical space to play with, but it has a lot of challenges. There are a lot of problems with sightlines, and to be honest, it just doesn't work with every type of show. Lastly for today, we have what is called black box theaters. This is a large black room where the seats are completely movable and can be arranged in any way you want. This way, we can make the performance area any way that that specific production wants it to be. The seats can be arranged in a proscenium setup, a thrust setup, an arena setup, or even an environmental theater setup. This is where the audience is actually on stage with the performers. If you're having trouble picturing this, a great example would be a dinner theater where the people are on the stage eating their dinner and the show is happening everywhere around them. So now that you've learned about different theater spaces, I want you to think, what are some of the theater spaces you've been to and what kind of arrangement are they? Think about the concerts, plays, or movies you've seen and think how changing the seating arrangement might change your relationship to those stories. I hope you enjoyed that video. Hit the like button, subscribe, share this video with somebody who might be interested in the topic. Sadly, no cats to wish you goodbye this time.